Okay, so moving right along to part 2 of our lecture, we're going to take a look at the Enlightenment in Europe and America. And as with early modern East Asia, this title here, the Enlightenment in Europe and America, is really the historical context, the historical backdrop to this portion of the lecture. As I mentioned, the first half of the course, we're moving a little bit faster chronologically, so most of the different sections of each lecture will have this kind of historical context. But what we're truly looking at, our main focus here, is Sor response, which is one of the most amazing pieces of writing ever, really. Certainly one of the best letters ever written. But we will briefly look at the Enlightenment first, and then look at how Sister Sor letter is a reflection of the beliefs, values, practices, etc. of the Enlightenment. I do want to make one note before we dive in. There's something I haven't mentioned yet, and at least I haven't discussed in detail, that I should have discussed in detail probably in our first lecture. I want to make a note and discuss it in detail here about translation. As I did mention in our first lecture, almost everything we're reading, about 90% of what we're reading, is in translation. This can be considered problematic for a number of reasons. One, going from one language to another is always a challenge because you have different rules of grammar and syntax. And then when you get into more nuanced art forms, say for instance poetry or drama, which we'll read later in this particular lesson, there's other nuances. For instance, in French, we're going to read the French poet Baudelaire at the end of this lecture. The French measure their lines of poetry in syllables, where in English we measure it in beats. So just something like that automatically is going to cause all kinds of problems for translation. So, one other point along those lines is a quotation you've probably heard before, which is that every translation is an interpretation. Because of the types of problems I just described, the translator has to, just by dint of the nature of translation, has to make some adjustments to convey, what the text says in a different language with different rules. And so they do have to make those adjustments. And so with that in mind, in making those adjustments, they potentially influence the meaning of the text, is what that quote, every translation is an interpretation, means. In other words, you and I read poetry, fiction, drama, and then we analyze it, we give an interpretation. This is what I think the literature means. If we come to a text written in English and we just read that text, we can then give our interpretation. But when we come to a text, say written in French, or in the case of the text here, Spanish, and it's been translated from Spanish to English, there's perhaps already an interpretation in front of us, an interpretation that came into existence through the act of translation. So all of this is to raise the question, why read things in translation? And everything I have just said, I believe, is absolutely true. But I want to temper that truth with some other truths, kind of qualified. And when I qualify, I want to say that even though reading things in translation is problematic, it's also wonderful for many reasons. And I want to share those reasons with you now. So one is, first and foremost, sheer practicality. You and I don't have enough hours in our lifetimes, our human lifespans, to learn French, Spanish, Italian, German, Russian, Nigerian, Japanese, Colombian, etc. We don't have time to learn dozens of languages. We're going to be reading texts in this class translated from dozens of different languages. So we just can't humanly possible learn all of them. We might be able to learn a few of them. And the question I pose, and this is a question that goes hand in hand with the concept of world literature, is why limit ourselves to to just a few languages? Why not read literature from as many different places as we can? Really, I think that's the mission of a world literature class. And so, point 2 here then is, why not then draw on the resources of others? While every translation is an interpretation, the translators know the languages we might not necessarily know, and they have labored for hours. They have tired laboriously to give us beautiful translations. Our textbook in the footnotes and the introductions really tries to point out the pains that translators have gone to balance everything, to preserve in poetry the rhyme and meter of the original verse, while also finding words in English that convey the meaning but also rhyme the way the original poem rhymes, so that you get a feel for how it flows and the sound of it. And the translations they've picked for the Norton Anthology are just absolutely beautiful. And so why not, if our goal is to learn or read, as many pieces from as many countries as we can, why not draw on the resources, the work of others, and use them to our advantage? And so, to sum up, translation is problematic, and reading Flaubert, Baudelaire in the original French is, if you can do it well, is certainly better than reading it in English. But being able to read Baudelaire and Sister Juana and Goethe and Dostoevsky and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I think is a much greater reward when we have the translations available to us that we do, than just being able to read Flaubert in the original French. So that's the piece I wanted to acknowledge about translation. I promise we're going to get right to the lecture now. So first, a little bit of background on the Enlightenment. It was defined by a quarrel between what we call the ancients, old ideas, and moderns, new ideas. And you particularly saw this debate in England and France, but it was also taking place in other countries. So what was specifically at stake here? Well, a major part of the Enlightenment movement was an emphasis on individualism. So the ancients had some fears about what individualism would lead to. Alienation, self-focus, lack of morality, and it did indeed lead to all of these things. Every time civilization makes a leap forward in history, there's progress, and progress can be a good thing, but progress always comes at a cost. And so the ancients may have been dwelling on their fears rather than the positives, but they weren't wrong. And so what I'm hoping to do here is to paint a full, very broad picture for you. On the other end of the spectrum were the moderns, who saw the advantages that came with individualism, autonomy, more freedom. Education for women was a benefit that came with that autonomy and freedom. Geographical and intellectual exploration. So with progress, there are always benefits and there are always costs. And there's not really any way to stop progress. But these were the costs and the benefits that were encapsulated with these two views during the Enlightenment. However, individualism was not the most defining trait of the Enlightenment. It was probably the second most. The most defining trait of the Enlightenment is actually something the ancients and the moderns agreed on, and that was the concept of reason. That's why I have it in bold there. If the Enlightenment is characterized by nothing else, what it is most characterized by is an emphasis on reason, the ability to use the mind to logically reason and figure things out. The ancients thought reason would, through the course of logic, naturally lead people back to eternal truth, so they liked it. But the moderns also liked reason because they thought logical reasoning would provide a means or new ways to discover fresh solutions to scientific, philosophical, and political questions. So both sides saw the advantages of the emphasis on logical reasoning. With all the emphasis on reason during the Enlightenment, people might ask, well, where was emotion? Where were feelings? That's usually the counterbalance to logical reason. Well, they were there. They were writhing beneath the surface. And so this movement, the Enlightenment, was followed by a movement called Romanticism, which we'll talk about in part 3 of this lecture. And usually when people look back and try to encapsulate these two movements, they think of Romanticism as emotion and the Enlightenment as reason, and that the Romantics focused on emotion so much because they were responding to rejecting the earlier ideas of the Enlightenment. That's very much accurate characterization. However, you can't have one without the other. And so for all of the reason that permeated the Enlightenment, you had beneath the surface emotion just, writhing, fighting to break free. And so you can see in many Enlightenment texts an undercurrent of emotion, as we'll see in Sister Juana's letter. And so it's an interesting thing to look for and to see how the writers of the Enlightenment grappled with that. We'll look at kind of a couple examples of that in a minute. There was a shift away from divine revelation to human forms of knowledge, science, statistics, etc. So in the western part of the world, which is where a lot of our texts, France, Russia, Germany, etc., come from, we're also going to look at the eastern part of the world more throughout the course too. But in the western part of the world, it was for, a long time, a very Judeo-Christian tradition. And so Christian type religious dominations really dominated and were pervasive. In the Enlightenment, you see kind of the first really full break from that, where the human mind was elevated because of this emphasis on reason. And so people thought they could figure things out now instead of waiting for God to show them to them. There were also sharp divisions between social classes and political parties. This is when you started to really see a divide between rich and poor. I mean, that has always been there, but it became more visible and even more pronounced. In a more kind of medieval or feudal system, there was more of a landowner could always abuse his workers in a feudal system, but sometimes they treated them great, and there was more of kind of a feudal bond between landowner and serf in a feudal system. When that economic system started to go away, you had the division between rich and poor became sharper, where factory owners, would treat their employees terribly, poor working conditions. And you also started to see, we'll talk about this more in the next part of the lecture with the revolutions of the Romanticism, but there was just starting to be at this time a shift away from monarchies. And so, before, when you just had a king who ruled by what he claimed was divine right, you didn't really have political parties. So political parties started to form during this time. Finally, the last point I want to make about the Enlightenment comes back to that idea of reason versus emotion and the undercurrent of emotion during this age of reason. Writers relied on convention. They really relied on strict traditional literary forms during this time because they saw the world as unstable and believed they could control it through their writing. But what's really interesting is the genre of satire emerged during this time, which is where a writer would speak in one voice with kind of one goal on the surface, and then the term irony means something different going on beneath the surface. And so you'd have that juxtaposition in a lot of writings during this time, and it would be done when it goes from irony to satire is when the distinction between what's on the surface and what's actually going on is really funny. This emerged as really a popular literary form for the first time, and it's that balance of reason and emotion. The writer's making a very logical argument, but through satire and the humor that comes from it, they're making kind of an emotional appeal. And there was oftentimes a very emotional driving force behind that argument. The reason why they wanted to make that argument was a very emotional one, oftentimes, as is usually our impetus for most of the things we argue for. A prime example of satire I want to just real briefly share with you, and then we'll dive into the sister's letter, is Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. Hopefully you've heard of this, read this text, or at least heard of it. But the idea with A Modest Proposal was he was an Irish writer, arguing for England to help Ireland during a time of famine. And so the modest proposal is a proposal that the Irish eat their own children. Two birds with one stone. You now have something to eat and you have fewer mouths to feed. Of course, he wasn't really suggesting eating babies, but it's so over the top. It's funny, but all of that underscores and reveals a real problem that the Irish needed some help because they literally didn't have food. And so that kind of writing really emerged during this time because of the emphasis on logical reasoning, but the undercurrent of emotion driving so many things. And Sister Juana's letter is a perfect example of that dual focus of reason and emotion, of saying one thing on the surface and the powerful truth being sort of obscured beneath the surface. So let's turn to her letter now. So her name is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, which means Sister Juana of the Cross in Spanish. And this piece we're going to look at is called Response of the Poet to the Very Eminent Sor Filotea de la Cruz. And so it sounds like one nun writing to another. We'll talk about that in a minute. Sister Juana was called the 10th Muse. In ancient Greece, there were the 9 muses of ancient Greece who writers like Homer evoked at the start of their literary works. She was one of the most famous writers of what we call New Spain. Because she was a very talented writer and her talent led to popularity, and she was actually one of the most famous poets of this time period, but she was female, which was rare for writers at that time. People called her the 10th Muse. And the place she comes from is New Spain, which was basically colonial Mexico. During the Enlightenment, and prior, Spain was the dominant imperial power, and they had conquered much of what is now South America, Latin America, Mexico, and they called it New Spain because they colonized it. So eventually, once that period of imperialism ended, we have the names we have today. And so she lived in what today would be considered Mexico, but at the time was called New Spain. Although she wrote a lot of different things, she's best known for her spirited defense of women's intellectual rights in this work, which we just call for short The Response, which is a good name for it. We'll talk about that in a minute. She became famous, but her writing has a distinctly American sensibility, and so she really put New Spain on the map. You had prominent writers in other countries throughout Europe that, because of the printing press and colonization, and there was a sense of a more global world now rather than insular world, you had writers who were world famous, but you didn't have any from New Spain until Sister Juana came along. And her writing is distinctly American. I'll talk about that term American in a second. So she really put New Spain on the map. The term America or American is a loaded one because here in the U.S. we often call ourselves, and people often refer to us as Americans, but really we're from the U.S., the United States of America, and there are lots of places called America, South America, Latin America, etc. And so when we talk about America or the Americas, we're really speaking more broadly and not just speaking of the U.S. And so this was a part of the world that was now for the first time appearing on the global scene. And so Sister Juana's writing was incredibly influential in putting New Spain and particularly the Americas on the map. She was born illegitimate to an upper-class Creole woman and a Spanish captain. So these kinds of relationships were prominent all the time in New Spain or the colonial Americas, and illustrate the complicated, how complicated life was there living in a colonial place. We're going to talk about imperialism much more later in the class. We're just getting a brief glimpse into it here. But so she wouldn't have had access to the normal means of education for anyone, but even for a high-born woman. And so she learned to read in her grandfather's library. Colonial Mexico at that time was a huge metropolis where there was all kinds of tension and conflict between the different racial groups because there had been so much racial intermixing, but it also had a lively artistic and intellectual scene in its vice-regal court, which was one specific part of it. And she was actually got to serve as a lady-in-waiting at that court before becoming a nun, so she was exposed to some of the more artistic scene there, even though she wasn't highborn. She became a nun in part for freedom to write in a safe environment. In this time, in this part of the world, women had very few rights, and certainly being able to write and publish things like poetry and drama were not among them. So if a woman like Sister Juana, who, as you will see in her letter, had just such an innate desire to read and write, wanted to be a writer, where could she go? How could she do that? The nunnery or the convent actually provided a great opportunity because women there were free from a lot of the other strictures of society, such as the pressure to marry, and you would have, some free time, some downtime. So it was kind of a safe space in that sense for writing. Her relationship to God and her, I guess you could call them secular writings, her poetry and drama primarily, her pieces of writing that don't directly address God or things of a spiritual nature. So that type of writing, I hate to call it, or hesitate, I should say, to call it secular, because she'd often talk about God and her relationship to God. But there's a difference between, I guess, writing theology or commenting on a sermon and then just writing poetry or drama. So that the difference between her clearly religious and more secular, that's the way I'll say it, her clearly religious and more secular writings, there was always that tension for her. And the textbook, kind of around this part of the textbook, it goes so far as to say that late in her life, in the early 1690s, she had like a crisis in faith and thought she could no longer believe in God the way she did before and continue to write. And her main focus was writing. I hesitate just a bit. I am by no means an expert on Sister Juana, but I hesitate just a bit with that, because when you read the response, and you specifically passages we're going to look at in just a minute, you'll see that she really believed that writing poetry and drama was not contradictory to living a religious life. And I don't know what would have pushed her away from that belief. Perhaps the critique she received, but she seems very well prepared to defend herself in this letter, which is just 4 years before she died, right at the time the textbook's talking about. So that's why I didn't put that bullet point on there, and I do have some pause with that point the textbook makes. But finally, in 1695, she died while nursing the convent sick during an epidemic. And colonial Mexico was struck by epidemics and geological problems, storms and things during this time, so she had kind of a hard last few years of her life. All right, let's take a look at the actual text. I need to give just a little bit of background, because this isn't like she just sat down and wrote a poem or a letter. There's a complex history with this particular piece of writing. So in 1690, she wrote a commentary on a sermon that had been preached many years before, and it was a sermon about Christ's love toward humanity. I don't know exactly what she said in her commentary, but my understanding is it was all very much in line with the views of the church. She wasn't saying anything that the church at that time would have considered heretical. But men in power took issue with a woman at this time having so much success as a writer. And so one of them, the bishop of a place called Puebla, published her commentary without her consent. Her sermon commentary here was something I think she intended to be private, and he went ahead and published it in the form of a letter and called it the Athenagoric letter, which means worthy of Athena. the goddess Athena from ancient Greece. So that is a positive title, but it's kind of a sneaky, unsavory move he made here, because in addition to publishing her sermon commentary as a letter, with that, when he published it, he wrote a letter to her and used the pseudonym Sor Filotea de la Cruz. So he pretended to be a made-up nun. And in this letter, he takes the voice of one nun, fake nun here, but that's what he's pretending to be. So he uses the voice of one nun advising the other to focus her attention, her talents on religious matters. So basically advising her away from writing poetry and drama. So this was a subtle, sneaky, but harsh rebuke of one of the first, very successful female writers. And so what we have here is her response back. And while the bishop was being quite sneaky and pretending to be another nun advising her, I think most people in the context knew what was really going on, but she used that. She used his own rhetorical strategy against him by pretending she was writing back to a nun when she responded with her own letter. She addressed him with his pseudonym here. And so she used his own rhetorical move against him and did a much more effective job of it. And what we have here is one of the most rhetorically effective pieces of writing ever. So what do we see when we first look at the actual letter, her response to the bishop? She declares her humility. The entire thing is written from a very humble position. She continuously presents herself as lower than him and as submissive to religious authority. However, this is balanced throughout with her showing her deep, deep knowledge of the Bible and of religious matters, and also her incredibly skillful writing. So she basically says one thing and shows another, shows that she's incredibly capable and knowledgeable, while at the same time outwardly declaring her humility. So you have an incredible combination of rhetorical precision and intense emotion. So really the two sides of the Enlightenment, reason and emotion. It's incredibly rhetorically savvy, incredibly clever what she does here. So we'll talk about why that's clever in a minute. But there's an emotional driving force beneath. You can see that she is passionate about the woman's right to be able to read and write and learn and be educated and be a woman of letters. And ultimately, that's comes through. You'd have to be really not familiar with this context at all to not pick up on it. It's like I said, that emotion writhing beneath the surface. The artistry of the piece itself demonstrates Sor Juana's abilities and thus constitutes part of her justification for her argument. So in other words, she can't come out very directly and critique the bishop. That would not go over well. But just by writing a piece that is this impressive in terms of its structure, its subtlety, its art, she makes the argument that women not should be able to write, be allowed to write, because they're incredibly capable of doing it well, quite well, amazingly well. And she relies heavily on scripture to support her argument, therefore showing that she has not sacrificed religious to secular study. The bishop's argument in his letter to her is that she should only write about religious things. And this letter, if you've read it, it's just filled to the brim, pouring over with references to the Bible that are really aptly placed. They're not heretical and they illustrate her points. That's incredible, to be able to use the Bible to support one's argument without contradicting the Bible, and to have the logic be incredibly sound, and to have that many instances of that use of scriptural references is incredibly impressive. So it shows that even though she was writing poetry and drama and more kind of secular types of things, she was not sacrificing her time with God and her religious beliefs to do that, as the bishop claims. So let's look at some specific passages here. Now I'll note that if you look at the exact pages I've specified on the assignment page, I've only asked you to read the introduction to the letter. It's a brilliant letter, and it's not that long, so you should read all of it if you can. But with longer texts like Faust and Notes from Underground coming up, I'm trying to spare you as much as possible. And the introduction alone shows her brilliance, although the entire thing is brilliant. If you read the entire letter, it goes into more detail, especially with her background and upbringing. But really, the whole thing is a treat to read. But really, from just the introduction, you can see the brilliance on display here. So I'm going to take you through that introduction and basically show you how she builds her argument and sets up the whole letter, because there's a very logical train of thought you can follow here. So she starts by declaring her humility, calling the bishop, pretending he's the nun, calling him the most learned, most prudent, most saintly, most loving letter, what he wrote to her. And so she's really lathering all this praise on him here. And then she says she's dealing with two impossibilities. One is, how does she even respond to someone so saintly? And then two, how does she thank him for publishing something without her permission? And so you read a note of, this isn't quite satire, but if you know the context, you know she doesn't quite mean what she says. And as you're reading it, you almost laugh because her praise is so over the top. But even when she's saying, thank you for publishing this letter, because she's saying, thank you for publishing this letter that I never would have considered publishing, she's saying, hey, you did this without my permission. And she's already very subtly pointing out some of his faults. She immediately uses a reference to John the Baptist's mother. If you've read Luke, she uses the term the mother of the Baptist and the mother of the Word, which is, you have to be familiar with Luke 1 and with Christianity to know the mother of the Word is Mary, because John calls Jesus the Word, and then her cousin Elizabeth is the mother of John the Baptist. And they're both pregnant around the same time. John the Baptist is born shortly before Jesus, and in Luke 1 they visit each other to talk about their pregnancies. And it's a really interesting scene in the Bible. If you're not familiar with it, you should read it. But it stands out for a number of reasons, because it's two women talking together in the Bible, but also because Elizabeth thought she was barren, and she's given a child here, much like the Sarah and Abraham story from Genesis. And so she's declaring to Mary how thrilled and excited she is to be pregnant, but she had no idea this could even happen because she was old and she thought she was barren. So she says, from whence comes such a thing to me? She's so grateful and so surprised at the same time. So by referencing this scene, Sister Juana is showing her knowledge of the Bible, but also continuing this kind of false thanking the bishop, like, how could this ever have happened? Who could have published this for me? I just can't believe this happened. So that's kind of the rhetorical move that's going on there. It's very emblematic of what she does throughout, saying one thing, implying another, and using the Bible to illustrate her point. She uses a phrase several times in the early pages where she says, a brief explanation of what I leave to silence. And so there's essentially a question early on she's posing of herself and answering of, why did she write this response to the bishop? Because on the one hand, she doesn't necessarily have to write a response. There's nothing about his letter that necessitates one. But because he's rebuking her for doing what she believes she was made to do, she feels she absolutely has to write a response. And so she keeps saying she's leaving something silent, but she says she wants to explain the silence. And what this really is a way to signal to her readers there's more going on beneath the surface. She can only say so much because she would offend people and get in trouble, and she doesn't want to, lose her position in the convent or anything. She has to tread carefully. So by saying she's leaving something silent, but at the same time explaining those things, she's subtly hinting there's more beneath the surface, kind of signaling to the readers, look for this, almost like giving them a treasure map to the hidden meaning. She again quotes the Bible and says, "Show me thy face." And this is again, this slide is kind of all about her early meditations on should she even write this letter. And so she's, in praising the bishop, kind of falsely praising him, she's saying, "Am I even worthy to write back to you? Should I even write back to you?" And initially she says she was unworthy, but then she talks about how in the Bible, Moses, when he first sees God in the burning bush, is overwhelmed by God's presence. And he's always overwhelmed by God's presence because it's the presence of God. But he gains some courage, and then when he's on Mount Sinai, I mean, it's still overwhelming for him to be in the presence of God, but he's not scared in the same way he was before. And she says she realizes through the process of writing here that, like Moses, she initially felt unworthy, but now realizes, well, it's completely acceptable to write to you, Bishop. Okay, so that first slide was, you could say, kind of the context of the first few pages where she's reflecting on whether she should write the letter or not. So she begins in the most humble position possible, and this is what I mean by a building argument, and she slowly moves to being more direct and less subtle now that she's cleared this ground by being humble, using logic in the Bible to show that yes, she can write back to the bishop. Next, she says, "I say that I receive in my soul your most saintly admonition to turn my studies to sacred books, which, although this comes in the guise of advice, will have for me the substance of precept, with a not insignificant consolation, that even earlier it seems my obedience foresaw your pastoral suggestion, as well as your guidance, inferred from the subject and proofs of the same letter." So I've italicized this portion to point out, as she's becoming slightly less subtle, she's saying here, what you said was in the guise of advice. So you were pretending to be a nun. You were pretending just to give me advice, but it's really more of an order, more of a directive. And so, again, she's subtle the whole way through, so she's subtly alluding to that. But the phrase "in the guise of advice," that borders on becoming a more direct critique. But she slips it in there in a way that it's still, the tone of the letter is still very humble and reverent, even if she's starting to make her critiques a little more direct. And she makes an important point here. He was saying she should only write about religious matters, but he was doing it when publishing a sermon commentary, something on religious matters. So he had a very indirect way he used a piece of religious reflection on her part to say you shouldn't write poetry and drama. So she's pointing out kind of the flawed approach of his critique even to begin with. She then says, "My not having written a great deal about sacred matters has been due not to defiance or lack of application, but to an abundance of the fear and reverence owed to those sacred letters." So same kind of thing of adopting this pose of being unworthy is part of her rhetorical approach in this letter. She's saying one of the reasons she hasn't written about scripture and religious matters that much is she's not worthy to approach the sacred text of God. So she's continuing that presentation of herself as a way of kind of veiling the argument beneath the surface. And here I'm going to get to the last couple pages of the introduction. She really has some of her most brilliant moments where she really makes some declarations about what she believes, but again, doing it in this subtle way that's not going to cause her to receive immediate rebuke. She says, "A heresy against art is not punished by the Holy Office, but by the prudent with laughter and the critics with condemnation, and thus, just or unjust, there is no reason to fear it, for one can still take the communion and hear Mass, and therefore it concerns me very little or not at all." So she builds on her previous claim that she's unworthy of sacred texts and adds another layer to the argument by saying if she's not writing about the Bible, if she's writing poetry and drama, these more kind of secular things, she can't be charged by the church with heresy. You can't really, if you say something heretical, I'm saying that in air quotes, about something that's not religious, you can't really be punished by that. So she's using the law of the church, the rules and regulations the bishop believes in, to make a point here that she should be allowed to do this. And she has a great explanation of that, where she says, the people who should judge it should be the audience, the readers, not the Holy Office. But again, that's what's on the surface. So she traps the bishop in a point of logic here, showing that she should be allowed to write poetry and drama, but beneath the surface, remember, there's always two things going on in this letter. It's not just that she should be allowed to write poetry and drama. She really believes that it's not a sin, that there's nothing wrong with it, that you can be a Christian and you can write, all kinds of things. And so that's really what you see through implication here. Okay. Next, we have what is probably the most important quote of the entire letter. Ever since the light of reason struck me, my inclination toward letters has been so strong and powerful that neither the reprimands of others I have had many, nor my own reflections I have engaged in more than a few, have sufficed to make me abandon this natural impulse that God placed in me. So she's saying two incredibly important things here, and she's saying them directly. This part's not subtle. God created her to write. If you look at the scriptures, they explain that God gives all different kinds of people all different gifts, and that they should embrace those gifts. And so she's saying she's been given the gift of writing here. And just because she's a woman and the church might frown upon that, God's authority trumps the authority of the church, and she believes he made her to be a writer, a woman of letters. And so she also says that others have advised her against writing before, and she's even reflected on herself, but none of that has stopped her. So the implication there is he can tell her to stop writing poetry and drama, but she's not going to. She's not going to listen to him. All right, so we'll wrap up with the final few sentences of the introduction here. If I could pay you, Senora, remember she's pretending he's a nun, something of what I owe you. She's been thanking him for publishing her sermon commentary without her permission. I believe I can only pay you in full by telling you this, for I've never spoken of it except to the one who had to hear it. She means confession. This is a Catholic form of Christianity. But having opened wide the doors of my heart to you, revealing its deepest secrets, I want you to find my confidence worthy of what I owe to your illustrious person and excessive favors. So these final few sentences are the springboard into the rest of the letter. She's built up her argument. She's cleared the ground. She's shown that she's humble, that she's doing what she believes God made her to do, that it's not a sin to do that it doesn't violate church law to do that. And thanking the bishop and praising him here, she's opened a door. And she's saying that he has opened that door for her now to bare her soul, to let her emotions out, to reveal to him, what she believes. She's cleared that ground, and so she can now spring into the rest of the letter and just bear it all, because that door is open. She's saying she's writing this to thank him, and the way to thank him is to tell him all of it. So she's basically, it'll be a confession, and he has opened that door. He's created a place in which for her to confess. And so she's used incredible logic and scripture to reach this point. She praises him by calling him an illustrious person. She thanks him for the excessive favors, publishing the letter. She's operating within the facade he created. This would be a perfectly acceptable thing for one nun to say to another nun. So he's really thought he was doing something clever, but really just created an opportunity for her to do something more clever and trump him with even better logic and even better use of scripture. And again, by talking about confession, she's keeping everything within the realms of the church in what it considered acceptable at this time. So hopefully through that close reading, you've seen the brilliance of this letter and how she works her argument to get her point across. I think really the most important things we can learn from this already came through the close reading, so only have a couple of brief statements for you. Sister Juana combines the two sides of the Enlightenment, brilliant rhetoric and intense emotion, by creating an argument that is highly logical and so thoroughly rooted in scripture, religious practices, and the very rules and standards the bishop wants to uphold, that he cannot possibly refute it. Sor Juana uses irrefutable argument to unleash her deepest emotional desire, the assertion of a woman's right to education, arts, and letters. Sor Juana's response stands out as an early example of feminism and one of the best examples of rhetoric in human history. So I also teach English 101 and 201, which are essentially rhetoric classes that teach students how to write arguments, how to write persuasively. And this is a piece of writing I would like to teach in there if I didn't have to provide so much historical context for it to make sense, because I think it's one of, if not the most compelling arguments ever written. She essentially has foolproof logic here. I've read this lots of times, tried to find the holes in her logic just for the sake of it, and she's essentially created an argument that the bishop cannot, her audience, the bishop, cannot refute, because she's done it within the rules and the scriptures that he upholds. And so he can't argue against her. But doing it, she creates this opening to make this declaration that women should be allowed to learn, read, and write. And there's nothing, unholy, or, nothing wrong with that. That's not a sin. That's not a crime. And so that's what she cares about most. And so that's the undercurrent beneath the surface, but she uses incredible logic to open the door for that argument she's so passionate about. And like I keep using the phrase poetry and drama because that's what she mainly wrote. This letter is kind of a one-off, but because it's such a well-argued declaration of women's rights, I think it's a better written declaration of, and more logically argued declaration of rights than Mary Wollstonecraft or some of the other feminists. It's just so well done. But it was a one-off. It's just become her most famous work because it's such a bold and well-argued statement of feminism. So I would encourage you to go out and read more of her writing, her poetry, and her drama. Norton has a great collection of it, the Norton Critical Edition of Sister Juana's selected writings. If we were having a full 10-week course, I would have assigned that so we could read more of her pieces because she's an absolutely wonderful writer. I hope you enjoyed this one.